My mom yelled at me to get out and never come back. So, I left without a word. Weeks later, my dad asked why I had stopped paying the mortgage. Then, my answer shut them down. She hadn't whispered it, hadn't dissolved into tears after. Linda, my mother, had delivered the instruction with the finality of a judge reading a life sentence. She meant it. So, I did exactly as I was told. I walked across the plush, new area rug that had appeared mysteriously in their living room, picked up my keys from the kitchen counter. The same counter I'd wiped clean 1,000 times, and stepped outside. I got into my car and drove away from the house my parents had lived in for decades. The house I had been quietly, exhaustingly keeping afloat. I am Demi. I am 29 years old, and for most of those 29 years, I was the dependable one. I was the daughter who never asked for much, the easy child who never caused any problems. Peace in our quiet suburban home outside Phoenix was something you earned by being useful, by performing well, and by saying yes before anyone could ask. My younger sister, Emma, saw through that performance early and rebelled, finding freedom outside the family structure. I stayed and played the role of the quiet pillar. I work as a regional manager in real estate. It is a title that sounds impressive on a resume, but it translates into long, grueling days, constant pressure, and the responsibility of solving other people's looming problems before they explode in my face. My job description was almost identical to my familial one. I was paid to manage expectations and stabilize things that were already falling apart. My mother, Linda, cared deeply about appearances. Her whole life revolved around how the house looked, how we looked, and most importantly, how other people saw us. Our lawn was always trimmed. The holiday decorations were always over the top, creating a picture of stability that was entirely manufactured. Inside, Linda's love was conditional. She had a way of delivering a compliment that always left a slight bruise underneath, praise that could be instantly revoked the moment you disappointed her carefully constructed ideal. My father, Robert, was the anchor of silence. He was a hard-working man who came home tired and avoided conflict like a plague. Whenever Linda would start a monologue about sacrifice or disappointment at the dinner table, Robert would simply stare at his plate and keep chewing, hoping that his neutrality would keep him safe. It never did. He was an absent presence, choosing to enable Linda's behavior through his own inaction. I thought moving out after college would fix things. My apartment in the city was small, but it was quiet, clean, and predictable. It was the first place I could truly breathe without feeling watched or judged. But distance only changed the presentation of the pressure. It came at me slower, wrapped in layers of guilt instead of outright demands. The entire dynamic shifted drastically after Robert lost his job a couple of years ago. At first, there was denial. Linda dismissed it as a temporary inconvenience, yet the tension in the house grew tighter. The bills started creeping into conversation, not as direct asks, but as comments dropped like breadcrumbs. The utilities went up again. Your father hates worrying about money. I started helping, a payment here, covering a bill there. It felt reasonable, a temporary salve to ease the pressure while Robert looked for work. But he didn't find any. He sent fewer applications, then stopped mentioning them altogether, spending his days on the couch with the television volume low. Linda, meanwhile, increased her public performance of exhaustion and sacrifice, complaining constantly about money while simultaneously spending it. New clothes, little updates to the kitchen, nothing huge at once, but enough to show off casually. I found myself sitting through Sunday dinners listening to her complaints, knowing exactly how much I had already quietly spent that month keeping the pretense alive. Robert would sometimes look at me, a flicker of something, maybe shame, maybe a plea, before looking away back to his empty plate. This quiet toxic contract of obligation had defined my existence for too long. The decision to leave had created a void, but it was quickly filled by a fragile, unfamiliar silence. I was supposed to be angry, but mostly I felt numb, watching the days pass without the usual Sunday dinner anxiety. My initial action was simple. I started paying the mortgage. This was the silent crisis. After Robert lost his job, the house, the symbol of their careful façade, quickly became unstable. Linda kept spending, obsessed with maintaining external appearances, even as the foundation crumbled. They never asked me directly. It wasn't a conversation where my father looked me in the eye and said, "Demi, we need help." It was just those incessant, carefully placed comments about the rising cost of utilities and the burden of groceries. I stepped in, not out of love, but out of the deeply ingrained fear of exposure and failure. Losing the house would shatter Linda's world, and I knew the resulting emotional fallout would be worse than any financial drain. I told myself it was temporary. I labeled the transfers, bills, and payments in my banking app, convincing myself I was just easing the pressure while my dad got back on his feet. But the temporary fix became a permanent drain. Weeks turned into months, then years. Robert stopped looking for work and retreated deeper into his passive silence. Linda's complaints only increased. Her sense of entitlement growing stronger the less she had to worry about the actual logistics of solvency. The financial weight became physically palpable. My personal life began to shrink. I turned down trips with colleagues, skipped nights out with friends, and drove the same old, reliable car while everyone else upgraded. Where did all my money go? They would joke, since I earned a good salary. I laughed it off, my chest tight. The truth was, every spare cent, every drop of my energy, went toward keeping a roof over my parents' heads. Sarah, my best friend, was the first one to truly notice the depletion. She was patient at first, then increasingly confused and frustrated. One evening, sitting on my small apartment couch, watching me fret over a budget that never balanced, she asked the question that cut straight through my denial. Her voice was quiet, but her words were sharp. "Are you building your life or holding theirs together?" I had no answer then. I just knew that every passing month cemented my feeling of obligation, trapping me in a duty I could no longer escape. Even as my own savings stagnated and my anxiety sharpened, I hadn't yet realized that the most dangerous part of this arrangement wasn't the money. It was the quiet sense of control I had given away. The silence that had settled in my apartment after the break was a deception. The toxic agreement was still intact, held together by my bank transfers and their determined avoidance. But the quiet period was about to end with the predictable ritual of Sunday dinner. It was an ingrained habit, a compulsion born of years of conditioning, that made me stop at the grocery store on the way to my parents' house. They hadn't asked me to, of course. Linda never asked directly for anything I might refuse. Instead, she asked with pointed remarks about how expensive things were getting, followed by a wistful mention of a specific premium cheese or a type of wine she liked. I picked up those items, choosing things she would comment on approvingly, trying to buy myself a few hours of immunity from her criticism. When I pulled up to the house, the familiar sense of dread settled in my gut. The street looked perfectly groomed, the suburban ideal I grew up navigating. I walked inside, the bag of expensive groceries digging into my hand. The first thing that caught my eye wasn't the food, but the living room. The large, plush armchair was still in its place, but the cushions were different. A richer texture, a deeper shade of blue. And the rug, the one I had just walked across during my expulsion, had definitely been replaced with a muted, patterned upgrade. It was the kind of quiet spending that felt like a deliberate taunt minor. Non-essential improvements that could easily be dismissed. Yet when added up, highlighted the gross disparity between their proclaimed poverty and their material reality. Robert was already seated at the dining table. His large frame slumped. He was scrolling on his phone, the screen casting a faint blue light on his wary face. He looked genuinely tired, the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than just a day's work. When he saw me, he managed a small, quick smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. They remained flat, betraying the anxiety he usually concealed. Then I saw her. My Aunt Brenda. She was Linda's younger sister. But they were studies in contrast. Where Linda was dramatic and focused on external validation, Brenda was independent, practical, and calm. She was visiting from out of state, an unexpected observer. Brenda rose immediately and gave me a tight, genuine hug. "It's so good to see you, Demi. Your mom tells me you're doing absolutely amazing." Linda's voice cut across the room, tight and sharp. "Well, she is. She's busy, of course. Very busy." I felt Linda tense behind me, a silent, warning signal. Brenda's innocent praise had upset the carefully balanced equilibrium. Dinner was difficult from the moment we sat down. Linda was talking too much, filling the air with noise and complaints about the economy, her friends, and the general unfairness of life. Robert contributed only in strained monosyllables, occasionally glancing at me, then quickly looking back at his untouched water glass. Brenda, trying to be a normal family member, tried to fill the gaps. She talked about her job, her recent travels, and neutral, harmless topics that families discuss when they aren't walking over a minefield of hidden resentments. I sat there, listening to Linda complain about how thin their budget was this month, all while knowing exactly how much money I had transferred 2 weeks ago, and calculating the exact cost of the new cushions Linda was currently leaning against. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in my chest, making it hard to breathe normally. My anxiety was peaking, a sharp, cold fear that tonight, finally, I was going to snap. Halfway through the meal, Brenda, oblivious to the fragile ecosystem of silence she had entered, mentioned something she should never have known. She laughed lightly, a soft, pleasant sound, and addressed my parents. "Honestly, I'm so glad you two got past that scare a few years ago. The house is still so beautiful." The room went instantly, shatteringly quiet. Linda froze mid-gesture, her hand holding a fork hovering above her plate. Her eyes, usually so animated, were suddenly vacant, fixed on the pattern of the tablecloth. Robert stopped chewing, and the silence seemed to absorb all sound. Linda finally broke it, her voice dangerously soft. "What scare?" Brenda blinked, confused by the sudden, Arctic shift in atmosphere. "You know, when things were tight after Robert lost his job. You said Demi helped you sort it out. You said she handled the details." My stomach dropped, a cold, heavy stone. The blood drained from my face. I could feel Linda slowly turning toward me, a predator calculating its strike. Her usual, forced smile didn't reach her eyes. In fact, the smile was twisting into something ugly. "Demi," she said, using my full, rarely used name, drawing it out like a threat. "What is she talking about?" I tried to keep my voice even, steady, fighting the instinct to lie or minimize. "It's not what you think. It was a long time ago. But it was too late. The dam had cracked." Linda's carefully constructed face, aid of competence and financial security, had been publicly breached by an outsider. And she couldn't tolerate the humiliation. "So you've been telling people we couldn't handle our own lives." She snapped, her voice low but carrying absolute venom. "You went behind our backs. You made decisions about this house without us?" Her voice rose, hitting a hysterical pitch that was designed to control and shame. The weight of years of resentment, obligation, and betrayal was about to be unleashed. Linda's voice, now rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch, accused me of insubordination rather than thanking me for solvency. "You went behind our backs. You made decisions about this house without us. I pushed my chair back, the sudden scraping sound against the polished floor a jarring noise in the suffocating silence. I stood up, my hands trembling, but the tremor was from adrenaline, not fear. After years of quiet enabling, the shame she was trying to force upon me was finally being rejected. The truth was out, ugly and unavoidable. I wasn't? I said, my voice steady though low. You were weeks away from losing it. I looked straight at her, defying her glare. I stepped in because no one else willed. The color drained from her face, leaving her cheekbones stark and white, before the blood rushed back in a blotchy, furious tide. She looked less like my mother and more like a cornered wild animal, desperate to regain control of the narrative. How dare you? She spat. How dare you humiliate me in my own home? My father, Robert, who had successfully played the role of the invisible man for the entire meal, finally stirred. He looked up, his eyes wide with a familiar, cowardly plea. Linda, maybe? Stay out of it. Linda snapped at him, her attention never leaving me. This is between me and my daughter. She took a quick, aggressive step toward me, closing the distance, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss designed to hit me where it hurt the most. You think because you help financially, you get a say. You think this is your house now. Her words were a swift, brutal confirmation of everything I had suspected about their transactional love. My years of dedication, my sacrifice, my financial stability were just tools to uphold her illusion, not acts of familial affection. The moment my help risked exposing their weakness, it became a crime. I never said that. I replied, the years of repressed anger finally giving my voice a clear edge. I just wanted to help. Her laugh was short, sharp, and entirely devoid of humor. Help. You call humiliating us, exposing our private business to Brenda, help. Aunt Brenda, who looked genuinely horrified by the scene she had unwittingly triggered, finally stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. But before she could speak, Linda delivered the final, cruel sentence. She didn't shout it, not exactly. She articulated it loudly, clearly, and with absolute finality. Get out and don't come back. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Every cell in my body registered the impact. This was the moment. The line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. The mother I had spent 29 years trying to please, trying to save, had explicitly rejected me. My eyes flicked to my father. He was staring at the tablecloth again, avoiding conflict until the very end, confirming his choice. His wife's comfort over his daughter's welfare. His silence was louder, more devastating, than Linda's shouting. It was the final, critical confirmation I needed. The house was not worth saving, and the family was not worth rescuing. I reached for my purse, which was still resting on the back of my dining chair. The trembling was gone, a strange, cold calm had replaced it. My heart was still pounding, but the emotional decision had been made. There was nothing left to fight for. Fine, I said. It was a simple, flat word. I turned my back on them, on the shrieking mother, the passive father, and the horrified aunt. I walked across the living room and out the front door. I didn't slam it for effect. I simply closed it quietly, firmly, definitively, as if closing a chapter in a long, tedious book. I got into my car. My breathing was shallow, constricted, but beneath the pain, a profound, alien emotion was stirring relief. It was the relief of a long-term prisoner suddenly finding the cell door open. The obligation was gone, not because I had abandoned it, but because they had physically and emotionally kicked me out of the responsibility. As I drove away from the carefully manicured, suburban street, I realized I hadn't cried. I hadn't yelled back. I had left with cold clarity. That break was made, and the thing inside me finally shattered. I knew I would not be coming back to fix things, not the way I always had before. The relief solidified into resolve. The rules of engagement had changed, and the power dynamic. The quiet agreement that I would pay to stay had just been obliterated by their own cruelty. The house was no longer my problem. The family was no longer my responsibility. I was free. I drove home, not to sulk or plot revenge, but to claim the peace I had just been handed. I expected anger, or maybe a devastating wave of sadness, once I was back in the quiet safety of my apartment. Instead, the first thing I felt was relief. It was a profound, quiet absence of dread that settled over me. There would be no more Sunday dinners. No more dissecting every word Linda said for hidden meaning. No more bracing myself for the next subtle reminder of what I owed them. My apartment, usually a place of refuge, now felt truly quiet for the first time in years. Quiet in a way that didn't hurt. I slept through the night. I woke up without the familiar knot of high, functioning anxiety tightening my chest. The world was still turning, but the obligation that had been shackling me to their orbit was gone. Days turned into a week, then a second. My phone remained silent. They didn't call to apologize. They didn't call to beg. They were waiting for me to break, waiting for me to fall back into the habit of saving them. But I had nothing left to say, and no intention of engaging in a conflict I had already finished. Then the 15th of the month arrived. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the early morning sunlight cutting a sharp line across the counter, with a mug of cooling coffee in my hand. My banking application pinged with the usual notification. It was the alert for the recurring transfer, the same payment that had gone out silently and without fail for years. It was the largest single bill I had, and the one that paid for the house I was no longer welcome in. I stared at the screen for a long moment. There was no dramatic racing of my heart, no internal panic music. Just clarity. I opened the application details and scrolled down, my finger moving with precise, almost surgical determination. I found the option to cancel the recurring transfer. The screen asked me to confirm the action. It was a digital double-check on a life-altering decision. Are you sure you want to cancel this long-standing payment? I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel a surge of rage or vengeance. I felt a quiet, powerful sense of finality. I clicked confirm. The notification disappeared. The money that was supposed to leave my account would stay. I closed the application and finished my coffee, the silence of the morning unbroken. I hadn't announced it. I hadn't warned anyone. I simply stopped performing the duty for which I had just been brutally discharged. That was it. A week passed. The silence broke, not with a bang, but with a cautious tap. The first message came from Robert. It was short, careful, and entirely avoidant of the actual drama. Hey, kiddo. Hope you're okay. Hey, kiddo. Hope you're okay. I didn't respond. A few days later, another text arrived. A few days later, another text arrived. We're having some trouble with the online bank account. Can you help us fix the access? He knew I handled the accounts, but still, no mention of the massive transfer I usually initiated. Still nothing from me. I held the phone, reading the messages, feeling my resolve harden. My boundary was not porous. By the third week, the first voicemail arrived. I didn't answer the call, but I listened to the recording later. It was Robert. His voice smaller than I remembered it, laced with confusion and a fragile attempt at normalcy. Jessica, the bank reached out to us. There might be an issue with the monthly payment. Can you call me back? We don't understand what happened. He used the word as if they were a unified, ignorant front. They didn't understand because they had chosen not to know. They chose to accept the flow of money without ever acknowledging the source or the cost. I deleted the message. I would not be pulled back into the role of silent manager. The confrontation was coming, but this time, it would happen entirely on my terms. I waited, knowing they would have to escalate, and finally name the crisis they had been avoiding for years. The cautious attempts at communication from my father had not swayed me. They were still avoiding the truth, still treating my silence as a temporary glitch they could bypass with a quick, polite message. But I knew the silent war would soon have to end, because the financial reality was closing in on them. 2 days after the voicemail, the front desk of my apartment building called. My chest tightened, but it wasn't the old, familiar knot of dread. It was a cold, protective tightening. "Demi," the attendant said, "are you expecting a visitor? Robert is here to see you." I felt the sudden jolt of his presence. He hadn't called again. He hadn't texted. He had simply shown up, escalating the conflict dramatically. It was a clear sign that whatever passive attempts they had made to fix the glitch had failed. The crisis was real, and they needed the manager, me, to solve it. I took a deep, steadying breath. I could have sent him away. I had every right to. But I realized this was the confrontation I had been waiting for, the moment they would finally have to acknowledge the reality of their dependence. "Yes," I told the attendant. "Please send him up." When I opened the door, the sight of my father hit me with unexpected force. He looked worse than he had at the dinner table. His clothes were rumpled, his shirt collar slightly askew, and he smelled faintly of old coffee and stale anxiety. His shoulders, usually broad, were slumped forward, making him look smaller, older. He tried to smile when he saw me, a reflexive attempt at normalcy that fell apart almost instantly, leaving his expression nakedly desperate. "Thank God," he said, stepping past me into the apartment before I could fully step aside. His voice was husky, raw. "We've been trying to reach you, Demi. Your mother is." I didn't let him finish the usual script. I closed the door quietly, forcing him to address the actual location. The fact that he was in my space, seeking my help. "Dad," I interrupted, my voice clear and even. "Sit down." He sat on the edge of my couch, rubbing his hands together rapidly, as if trying to generate warmth. He looked entirely out of place in my clean, modern, deliberately uncluttered space. "Your mom's been upset." He started again, attempting to steer the conversation back to Linda's feelings, the default family priority. "She didn't mean what she said that night. You know how she gets, Demi, when she feels cornered. She was just angry." I remained standing, forcing him to look up at me, to meet my gaze. "Dad," I repeated, my tone shifting from commanding to simply factual. "Why are you really here?" He swallowed hard. He looked down at his hands, fiddling with his wedding ring. The silence stretched, tight and unbearable. Then he whispered the word that had been avoided for weeks. "The mortgage." I didn't react, waiting for him to continue, to own it. "Hi," he looked up. His eyes bloodshot and watery. "The payment didn't go through. The bank sent notices. We don't understand what happened. It was supposed to be automatic." I crossed my arms, not aggressively, but to keep my own body steady, to keep the old instinct to fix things from taking over. "You do understand, Dad," I said without emotion. "You just don't like the answer." He shook his head rapidly, a desperate, futile movement. "You can't just stop. Not like this. You know how the accounts work." I finally sat down in the armchair across from him. I wanted him to see me clearly. Not as a panicked child, but as an adult making a deliberate choice. "Actually," I said, meeting his frantic gaze directly, "I can." And I did. He stared at me, dumbfounded. The years of denial were crumbling in front of him. "Demi," he said slowly, pleading. "Your mother is scared. We're facing foreclosure." I let out a short, cold breath. She wasn't scared when she told me to get out and never come back. She was angry. He countered, his voice cracking. She was just lashing out. She was clear. I corrected him. She was absolutely clear. She set the terms of our relationship. And I accepted them. He rubbed his face with both hands. "We're family, Demi. We help each other. You always did. We just need you to cover this month. Just until we figure something else out. I leaned back into the chair, the position giving me a sense of solid, unshakable power. I did help. I confirmed. For years. And then, I began to lay out the evidence, not as an accusation, but as an itinerary of my sacrifice. I spoke in a quiet, measured voice, using facts and figures that he and Linda had chosen to ignore. I told him how long I had been covering the largest bill tied to the house, how it started as a temporary fix when he lost his job, and how it had become a permanent, mandatory obligation. I detailed how I rearranged my life, my budget, my future, around those payments and quiet, constant transfers. I told him about the trips I skipped, the plans I put off. I detailed how I had lived smaller than my income dictated, just to prop up their unsustainable façade. He listened, his head shaking slowly, his eyes wide. He genuinely looked like he was hearing a foreign language, a secret history of his own household. We didn't know, he mumbled weakly. We really didn't know the exact amount. I shook my head. You knew someone was paying, Dad. You knew the payment was going through every month, even though you hadn't worked in years and Mom kept spending. You just didn't ask who. Because as long as the problem was solved, you didn't have to face the consequence. His eyes filled completely with tears, blurring the lines of my living room. We're going to lose the house, Demi. We will lose everything. I accepted the statement, the possibility. That, I said calmly, it's a possibility. You can't let that happen. He pleaded, desperation breaking through. Your mother won't survive it. The shame will kill her. I felt something cold and heavy settle in my chest, a final, unyielding piece of iron. It wasn't cruelty, but finality. The compassion I once felt was gone, replaced by a deep understanding of self-preservation. Dad, I said. I already lost something. I lost my place in this family the night she kicked me out of a house I was helping keep. He opened his mouth, searching for a rebuttal, a defense. An argument that would shift the guilt back onto me. But there was nothing. He closed his mouth, defeated. He finally understood that the debt was emotional, and I had just filed for bankruptcy. What do you want us to do? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, broken and small. The question was the ultimate surrender of control. He was asking the manager to fix a problem she no longer owned. I held his gaze. Figure it out yourselves. Figure it out yourselves. The words hung between us, the simplest and hardest truth I had ever spoken to him. My father sat immobilized on my couch, staring at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a stranger. He was expecting the old Demi, the manager who would listen to his plea, calculate the risk, and reluctantly agree to cover the debt one more time. Just this once. He was expecting the tears, the arguing, the emotional manipulation that had always signaled my compliance. But there was only quiet resolve. I continued, my voice steady, laying out the ledger of sacrifice. I took that mortgage payment on when I was 25 years old. It started as a few transfers to bridge a gap, and it immediately became a permanent fixture. Every month, for 4 years, I paid the largest bill associated with that house. I did it while your wife was updating cushions and complaining about the price of gas. He opened his mouth to protest, a weak sound escaping him. But I cut him off not with anger, but with an unrelenting stream of facts. I missed Sarah's trip to the coast last year because I couldn't risk the savings, dipping below the minimum threshold. I needed to cover the house for 2 emergency months. I postponed my own plans for graduate courses. I have driven the same car since college. I have lived smaller, quieter, and under constant financial pressure, so you too could maintain the illusion of stability and dignity. He looked away, his face crumpled with shame. We didn't realize how much, Demi. We just thought you were successful, that it was easy for you. Success doesn't negate cost, Dad. And it certainly doesn't justify being used. You didn't realize how much because you chose not to look. You delegated the hard reality of your life to the child, who was easiest to rely on. His eyes filled with tears, not of apology to me, but of pure terror about the impending foreclosure. We are going to lose the house, Demi. We have nowhere to go. Everything is tied up in that property. Your mother. He broke off, unable to finish the thought. I knew the rest. Your mother won't survive the shame. Then she finally faces the consequence of the choices she made? I stated. It felt cold to say it. But I knew that if I softened now, even slightly, I would be back on the hook. He started crying in earnest then. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a man accepting his fate, but the heavy, gasping sobs of a child who had dropped something irreplaceable. He started to beg. Demi, please. Just for another 6 months. I'll get a job, I promise. Linda will apologize. She will finally see what you've done for us. I'll make her appreciate you. Don't do this to us. Don't destroy us. His shoulders shook with the force of his distress. He reached out a trembling hand, trying to bridge the gap I had created. I listened to every promise, every desperate, hollow vow. I heard the old, familiar tune, do this for us, and we will finally give you the love and appreciation you deserve. It was the same carrot they had dangled for years. When he finished, I didn't reach out. I didn't offer a tissue. I didn't even shift in my seat. Dad, I said softly, my voice devoid of both pity and anger, infused only with the absolute clarity of final decision. I already lost something. I let the weight of that statement hang in the air. I lost my place in this family the night she kicked me out of a house I was helping keep. He opened his mouth to form a new argument, but I didn't wait. I stood up, walked to the door of my apartment, and opened it wide. The sudden rush of air from the hallway felt stark and cool. I looked back at him. Sitting alone on the edge of the couch, shoulders slumped, tears streaming down his face. This was the climax. The moment of maximum pressure. I had to choose between my future and their collapse. I'm not paying anymore. I didn't offer an explanation or justify my decision. I simply let the silence that followed speak for itself. He understood that my resolve was final, that no amount of begging or promises could restore the years of sacrifice they had wasted, and then explicitly rejected. Slowly, heavily, like a man carrying a massive weight, he was no longer strong enough to bear. Robert rose from the couch. He walked toward the door, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet mine. He was leaving not just my apartment, but the life of comfort and denial I had enabled him to live. He walked out, and I closed the door. Immediately, my phone lit up, flashing multiple notifications. Messages poured in, this time from Linda. I could see the beginnings of the text bubbles in my notification center, frantic apologies, please, dramatic pronouncements of regret, followed quickly by demands. I didn't need to read them. The conversation had already concluded when I opened the door for my father. The dynamic had shifted irreversibly. They were facing the consequences, and I was finally free of the burden of saving them. I put the phone on silent and walked back to my peaceful, quiet kitchen. The crisis was theirs now. The immediate fallout of my final sentence didn't crash down all at once. It arrived in pieces, a slow, continuous dismantling of the life I had known. First, the calls stopped. Then, the frantic flood of texts from my mother slowed down to sporadic, formal messages. The apologies eventually turned into sharp, confused questions about paperwork, and the questions faded into a silence that was almost deafening in its lack of demand. I didn't respond to any of it. Not out of spite, but because I knew answering would pull me back into a circular conversation I had already chosen to leave. A few days after my father's desperate visit, I drove past the old house on my way to a regional meeting. I didn't plan the route. It was simply the most direct. As I slowed down, I saw it a small, white notice taped conspicuously to the front door. The official, unavoidable warning. Inside, through the living room window, I saw Linda. She wasn't on the phone or pacing. She was standing still, watching the street like she was waiting for a miracle. Waiting for the manager to show up and fix the inevitable. I didn't stop the car. I didn't slow down enough to be recognized. And in that quiet moment, accelerating toward my own future, I felt something entirely new. It wasn't the loud, triumphant feeling of victory. It was the quiet, profound peace that arrives when you finally stop trying to save people who never intended to save themselves. In the ensuing months, my life changed, not with grand gestures, but with the accumulation of small freedoms. My apartment felt different, not physically, but emotionally. Mornings were quieter. My coffee tasted better because I wasn't calculating someone else's mortgage payment in my head. I started sleeping through the night again, without jolting awake, my heart racing, anticipating the next family crisis. Sarah noticed the change before I did. We started spending time together again, slowly, carefully rebuilding the friendship that my anxiety had nearly destroyed. She told me I seemed present in a way I hadn't been before, like I was finally standing inside my own life, instead of hovering anxiously on the periphery of theirs. We cooked. We planned small trips. And for the first time, there was no guilt attached to my time or my money. Work stress was still there, of course, but it was my stress. It had clear boundaries. It ended when I closed my laptop. The tension I felt belonged to my career, not to a decades-long debt to my childhood. I heard through distant relatives that my parents had to make serious adjustments. They sold the house. They moved to a much smaller place. There were fewer extras, fewer luxury items, and for the first time in years, they were forced into real, difficult conversations about money and responsibility that they had successfully avoided for years. I didn't feel victorious, nor did I feel regret. I simply felt lighter. I learned a crucial, hard lesson in those months. Boundaries don't have to be loud to be firm. Walking away from a toxic relationship doesn't mean you didn't care. It means you chose yourself. And letting people face the natural consequences of their own choices isn't cruelty. It is radical honesty. My money was finally mine. My time was mine. My peace was mine. And nothing they said or did after that final conversation changed any of it. Some people believe family means endless, selfless sacrifice. I learned the hard way that real love cannot survive on guilt, control, or silence. Walking away didn't make me heartless. It gave me my life back.